Welcome to this special seminar which we are doing on the World Economic Outlook. We are very privileged and honored to do this along with the IMF. And as you can see, we have two visitors who are specially come to present this research with us today. On the dais, we have with us the senior resident representative in India. He's from the IMF, located in India, Dr. Ranil Salgado. Then we have Dr. Hippolyte Balima, Dr. Surjit Bhalla, and Dr. Nick Sander. I'm going to briefly introduce the key speakers for the day today and then hand over the mic to the chairperson for the session, Dr. Bhalla. Dr. Bhalla has been at the IMF as the executive director. Before that, he was the member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. He has worked earlier in the World Bank. In India, he has been a member of the Secondary Markets Advisory Committee of SEBI and the National Statistical Commission. Dr. Bhalla is a very well-known economist in our country. He has written extensively, published books, and is a regular columnist. His book, The New Wealth of Nations, another very popular work. Dr. Nick Sander is an economist in the Economic Modeling Division of the IMF Research Department. Before joining the fund, Nick was a senior economist at the Bank of Canada and at the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. His research focuses on production networks and understanding the macroeconomic effects of supply shocks. Dr. Hippolyte Balima is an economist in the World Economic Studies Division of the IMF's Research Department. He has previously worked on IMF programs, bilateral surveillance, and capacity development in the Middle East and Central Asia, as well as in the Monetary and Capital Markets Department. Before joining the IMF, he worked at the World Bank in the Macroeconomics and Fiscal Management Global Practice. His research has been published in several academic journals, including the Journal of Development Economics, European Economic Review, and IMF Economic Review. And he has contributed significantly to various IMF policy publications. With this, I hand over to you, sir, to conduct the proceedings.
Years, New Zealand's victory in the most recently, one of the most exciting test matches that I've seen, and to Mr. Balima. And I can't think of a more exciting time to be presenting the World Economic Outlook. Maybe these events come once in a decade. I imagine 2009 was parallel to what we are going to hear today. And prior to that, I don't know when it was such an exciting. So I'm really looking forward to your analysis about what happens to world growth as well as sustainability of its growth. Look forward.
Is there a clicker for slides, or I just asked you for the next slide? Okay, sounds good. Just keep time.
So we should go sit there, right? Is this, where? Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much for hosting us today. I'm here to present Chapter 2 from the World Economic Outlook this year for October, The Great Tightening, Insights from the Recent Inflation Episode. Do you mind going to the next slide? Thank you. And what motivated this chapter was the extraordinary inflation episode we saw recently, which was unique in so many ways. It began when the pandemic hit and there was prolonged economic shutdowns coupled with unprecedented fiscal and monetary support. As we started to emerge from the pandemic, but lockdowns were still in place, demand tilted in an unprecedented way towards goods. At the same time, firms found that they were unable to meet this demand for goods and ramp up production, leading to the beginning of supply bottlenecks. Then as economies reopened more fully, savings people had accumulated during the pandemic, perhaps due to the unprecedented fiscal and monetary support, people started to draw down those savings and started to spend. They also started to go out and consume more services, and we saw a more broad-based boom in total spending. Supply bottlenecks that had emerged in the pandemic, and then coupled with the war in Ukraine, meant that productive capacity could not expand to meet this unprecedented surge in demand. The result, as you can see in the graph on the left here, around early 2022, is we saw global inflationary pressures. There's 3 lines in this graph: in red, advanced economies, in blue, emerging economies, and low-income countries in yellow. And you can see that for the median advanced economy and the median emerging economy, inflation peaked at around 8%, which is extremely high for recent times, and then for low-income countries it was even higher. In the graph on the right, you can see central banks, once this inflation really started to take off, raised their policy rates also very quickly, for the median country by about 400 basis points within 2 years, which is a lot. So the goal of this chapter is to try and understand what happened and see what lessons can be learnt for the future. Do you mind going to the next slide? Thank you. So we're going to ask 3 questions. Firstly, what happened? There I'm going to show you some graphs, stock taking, the inflation dynamics of the last 4 years. I'll show you the sectoral breakdown of how this inflation emerged. I'll talk about the effect on Phillips curves, which I'll define in a few slides. And I'll show you a novel decomposition of inflation in terms of these, economic demand, as well as the effects of energy prices and food prices and commodity prices. Next, we ask about what the monetary policy reaction to this inflation was, and whether the transmission of monetary policy has changed. I won't have time today to talk about monetary policy transmission, but if you're interested, I encourage you to check out the WEO chapter. And then finally, through the lens of a structural model, we're going to ask what lessons can we draw for monetary policy in a world where these sort of extreme supply shocks that we saw in COVID happen more frequently. Next slide. So to start with, let's look at what happened, and I'm going to focus here on inflation, and then I'll move to contextualizing monetary policy later on. Next slide, please. So I've already shown you the graph on the left that this inflation surge was global. It also was a surprise to many economic forecasters. I'm going to pick on the IMF as a forecaster here. So the graph on the right shows the inflation surprises of the World Economic Outlook projections. A positive number means that inflation came in above what was projected. A negative number, inflation came in below. What's the message here is, particularly for advanced economies, the IMF did not see this surge in inflation coming, and this is true of many forecasters forecasting many countries around the world. Also, what's interesting is it seems like the disinflation, so inflation peaked and then came down rapidly, that rate of disinflation also seemed to be a surprise. I'll talk about both later. Do you mind going to the next slide? Okay. So as discussed, this inflation had a strong sectoral component, in particular because of the surge in demand for goods early during the pandemic. So in the graph on the left, I'm showing in solid lines goods price inflation. For the red, it's advanced economies, and for the blue, it's emerging and developing economies. And you can see that early in the pandemic, even in late 2020, you can see goods price inflation starts to rise. That then peaks much later in 2022, but you can see services prices remain subdued and only start to accelerate around 2022. And so understanding this sectoral component, what's going on with some goods versus, some products versus others, is essential. More particularly, if we zoom in on the graph on the right, for different regions of the world, we can decompose the rise in inflation as well as the disinflation into the contribution of food in red, energy, transport and housing in blue, and other components in yellow. And the key message here is that food and then energy contribute a large amount both to the rise in inflation as well as to the disinflation. Next slide, please. So, to understand this in some more detail, we're going to use more granular sectoral data, and we're going to go and classify sectors into two groups, those that have high energy dependence and those that don't. What do I mean by high energy dependence? I mean these are sectors that in order to produce whatever they produce, they need a lot of energy. So think about aluminium smelters, steel mills. These are high energy dependent sectors. Economists in seminars, legal services are potentially not as having as high energy dependence. So what we see is the sectors with high energy dependence are the ones that raise their prices sooner. So their inflation in these sectors rises earlier than low energy dependent sectors and peaks much higher. Inflation in low energy dependent sectors still rises and actually hasn't fallen by as much as the energy dependent sectors. We have a third way of breaking down these sectors, which is the graph on the right. We're only able to do this for European countries because of data availability. But you can see that what our groupings are is in the blue, we have sectors whose prices are very flexible. Think about goods that are sold on centralized exchanges, oil, a lot of agriculture, commodities, things like that are going into the blue. Whereas iPhones, postage stamps, electronics in general, these are sectors where prices don't move as frequently, and they're going into the red. The message here again is the flexible price sectors contributed a lot to the surge in inflation, as well as to the rapid disinflation. But also notice, because of the gradual rise in the low price flexibility sectors, later on in 2023, they're actually contributing more to the inflation staying stubbornly high than the flexible price sectors. Next slide, please. Now, when we think about surges in inflation, our minds tend to go back to the 70s, where the last sort of global surge in inflation happened around the time of the oil price shocks. And two key stories emerged from that episode. One is that inflation expectations became unanchored. People started believing that inflation was always going to be there, adjusted their spending patterns, and that contributed to inflation being high. I'll talk about that in the graph on the left. The second story was about wage price spirals. When people experience an inflation, they try and get lobby for their incomes to rise to compensate for the inflation. To the extent that they're successful, that further raises prices, which further leads to demands for higher wages, and so on. That's the graph on the right I'll talk about. So starting with the graph on the left, inflation expectations. What we see in the 2020s episode is actually long-run inflation expectations, shown by the lines that are dashed, actually have remained substantially anchored. Short-run expectations, shown by the solid lines, have gone up, but as inflation's eased, they've also come down. So we're not seeing a repeat of the kind of unanchored expectations that we saw in the 70s. Secondly, and the graph on the right shows, we're not seeing evidence of wage price spirals. The solid lines in the right-hand graph are showing you nominal wage growth, and the dashed lines are showing you CPI inflation. So when the inflation rate is above wage growth, real wages are falling, and when it's below, real wages are rising. And what we see is during that inflation episode, actually real wages in emerging and developing economies stagnated, whereas normally real wage growth was positive. And for advanced economies, real wage growth turned negative. So again, we're not seeing evidence of these wage price spirals. And next slide, please. Okay. Next, I want to talk about a key relationship we look at to try and think about the inflation dynamics, which is what's called the Phillips curve. So Phillips curve basically is a relationship where you have inflation being a function of expectations and also slack. Now, slack is something that's a little hard to measure. So we have many ways of measuring slack, and unfortunately for you as the audience, I'm going to show you slack in several ways in this graph, which is largely for reasons of data availability for the different exercises we'll be doing. So why is slack important? The idea is that when the economy has a lot of slack, so there's many factories are idle, many workers looking for work, ramping up production is relatively easy without needing to raise costs. And so we expect inflation to be low when slack is high. When slack is low, however, workers are all employed, factories are working 100%. It's very hard to ramp up production when demand is high, so we expect prices to go up. So that's basically what I'm plotting for you on the left graph here. To start with, we focus on data from a large variety of countries in the 2010 to end of 2019 decade. So right before COVID starts. That's the blue dots, and you can see the blue fitted line that's slightly negative. Says, sorry, I haven't told you the measure of slack, I apologize. On the horizontal axis, our measure of slack is the unemployment gap, which is basically unemployment relative to some long-run trend. So when that gap is positive, unemployment is higher than its long-run trend, that's an evidence of slack in the economy. So what we see in the 2010 period is actually a negative relationship that's actually quite flat. So we don't see a strong connection in that period between inflation and slack, and this is something that was well documented during the time, particularly for advanced economies. What's interesting, however, is the next 3.5 years, which we show in red. Now here, two things have happened. The intercept of the line has shifted up, and it's become more negative in slope. So the shifting up of the intercept means that for unemployment gaps, where the data tends to cluster, for a given gap, there's more inflation. So that's what we saw during the COVID period. Our measures of slack seem to suggest much more inflation than we were expecting given the relationships we saw in the earlier decade. Secondly, the slope. What that means is that reducing slack is going to have a bigger impact on inflation than we saw in the previous decade. And that's the other interesting fact. Now the graph on the right, what I showed you on the left is only for core inflation. The graph on the right will show that we see the same thing for goods inflation in red and services inflation in yellow in terms of the change in slope. What we don't see that's interesting and will inform the modeling exercise I'll talk about later is that the wage Phillips curve doesn't seem to have steepened. Next slide, please. Finally, using the Phillips curve and other relationships and following the procedure in a paper by Dow and co-authors, we do a decomposition of inflation in the US, other advanced economies, and emerging markets here. Three key messages I want to leave you with from these graphs is expectations, which are in blue, are really contributing a constant amount. It's not changing over time, meaning that expectations aren't contributing to the surge in inflation. Slack, other than for the US, which is in red, also doesn't seem to be contributing that much to inflation during this period. These are the sort of standard things we'd put in the Phillips curve. What is contributing to inflation? Well, it's basically what we'd call headline shocks. So the difference between headline and core inflation is food and energy. So food and energy are contributing directly to the inflation surge. You can see that in the sort of lighter blue and lighter red colors. But also, this decomposition allows us to measure the contribution that food and energy prices have to other prices. That's shown in the yellow and green. And you can see the yellow and green are also, importantly during this episode, quite high. So to understand the inflation episode, we not only need to look at prices across many sectors, we also need to understand how they interact and affect each other. Next slide, please. Okay. Next, I want to talk about what monetary policy did. And so a natural thought experiment is, well, the last time we saw a tightening of this sort was in the 70s. And so I'll do a comparison of what happened recently to typical tightenings in the 70s. Next slide, please. First, let me talk about what happened in 2020. So the graph on the left, I'm showing you one measure of the stance of monetary policy. This is the real interest rate. That's the nominal rate that central banks directly influence, less inflation. Now, what you can see is that that basically during most of the pandemic period for a large range of countries, these were stimulatory. Real interest rates were negative. It's only in mid-2023 or early 2023 when we start to see these real rates becoming positive, and also we see what we're calling in this chapter the Great Tightening. Many countries raised their interest rates at the same time. Now, some economies, notably Brazil and Chile, tightened quite a bit earlier than others, so there is some variation here, but this is the broad pattern we see. On the graph on right, we're showing that when these countries started raising their nominal interest rates, inflation was around about 4%, and for many countries, the output gap, which is these yellow dots, was positive. Next slide, please. Okay, now I'm going to compare things to the 1970s. What we do in the 70s is we classify 200 of what we call inflation episodes. These are situations where for a country, inflation within a year rose by over 2 percentage points. We then further classify these inflation episodes in the 70s into two groups, what we call resolved and what we call unresolved. Resolved is if that inflation spike comes down within 5 years to within 1% of its initial level. Unresolved means inflation has not come down to that level. The graphs on the left I'm showing you are resolved. I'll show you unresolved on the next slide. The graphs on the right are showing the 2020 experience. Now, if we start with the top row, which is showing inflation, you can see that relative to these resolved 1970s episodes, in the gray area, that initial rise in inflation, you can see that 2020 is a little higher, but the main difference is these resolved episodes, after the initial spike, inflation stays roughly constant for a year. In the case of the 2020s, inflation increased further, so that's a difference. We also see a bigger difference on the bottom row, which is showing nominal interest rates in yellow and real interest rates in blue. What we see here is in both cases, nominal interest rates increased a lot, but in the case of the resolved episodes, they increased so much that the real rate went up very quickly. By contrast, in the 2020 case, real rates didn't increase initially, they went down. It's only after the tightening continued that they actually started to rise. So that's a key difference. Next slide, please. If we look at the unresolved episodes, we start to see, well, on inflation, the spike in inflation in these unresolved episodes is much higher than we saw in 2020. But the reaction of the real interest rate has the same sign as the 2020 episode. But for the unresolved cases, the fall in the real interest rate is much, much more pronounced. So I'm going a bit slower than I intended, so can we skip 2 slides? The rough message I want to leave you to from this section is basically relative to the 70s, the 2020 situation is not atypical, but also not the most extreme cases. So it's sort of between these resolved and unresolved cases. Okay, in the final part of the talk, I want to focus on what lessons we can draw for monetary policy in a world where these types of shocks we saw in COVID and the aftermath happen more frequently. Next slide, please. So I'm going to do this with a 2-country structural model. This model is going to be a dynamic new Keynesian framework. And what does that mean in particular in this case is we're going to have Phillips curves in this model, but we're going to have them at the sector level. We have 11 sectors in this model. Each sector will have a Phillips curve. There are going to be 2 countries, so 22 Phillips curves. We're going to calibrate the model to match the USA and then have a rest of the world block. And what's important is how we capture supply bottlenecks. We're going to have what we call an occasionally binding labor usage constraint, but all you need to see to understand it is this graph on the right here, where without bottlenecks you can see there's a supply curve in grey and a demand curve in the solid black, and when they intersect you get the price and quantity being determined that way. Now when these bottlenecks start to bind, you get the blue line. The supply curve becomes vertical. No matter what demand is, you cannot increase production. And instead you get a large rise in the price in that sector. And then using this model with these supply bottlenecks, we're going to do 2 model experiments. Firstly, I'll show you in a hypothetical case that the Phillips curve can steepen due to these supply constraints. Then, once we've got that mechanism in mind, I'll start talking about what happened in the last four years' experience using this model, and then we can do some counterfactuals, what would have happened if monetary policy were different and so on. Okay, next slide, please. So to start with, I want to focus on the graph on the right. Here, I'm going to arbitrarily impose different supply bottlenecks in all of our 11 sectors in one country. Those are shown by the horizontal dotted lines in that right-hand figure. So the vertical is going to show the change in labour, and for each coloured sector, that horizontal line is the maximum level of labour our model allows when that bottleneck is enacted. The solid lines show the actual model's behaviour when we vary on the horizontal the stance of monetary policy. So when monetary policy is on the left, it's very contractionary. Demand is low, and so we see that in the model, employment is low. As we sort of loosen monetary policy and move to the right, employment increases until sectors start to hit their bottlenecks. At that point in those sectors, labour cannot rise because they're at its maximum, and you see these lines starting to become horizontal. Now, as we do that in those sectors, they can't increase quantity, so if demand increases, they have to increase their price. What happens if we collect overall production and plot that on the horizontal, on the left graph? We take overall inflation in the economy and plot it on the vertical of that left graph, you get the blue line. As these constraints start to bind, you see the Phillips curve becoming highly nonlinear. Whereas the red line is the case of what that Phillips curve would be if we didn't have any supply bottlenecks. Next slide, please. We can also account for that shift in the slope of the Phillips curve I showed you, in the intercept, of the Phillips curve I showed you earlier. That's shown by the line in purple on the right-hand figure. All that's changed from the purple relative to the blue is we put in place an increase in demand for the sectors with the tightest supply constraints. That's matching what we saw in 2020 with this increase in demand for goods, where goods sectors were the ones most likely to be supply constrained. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so given that we understand that mechanism in the model, when these constraints start to bind, we see more action on prices, less action on quantities. Let's go and fit this model to data. What I'm showing you on the left is inflation in the US. In black, that's the data, that's what we observed. On the right graph, the black line is showing you real GDP, detrended. Now what the bars are showing you is a contribution of different factors to that black line. And what we see in blue is we see the effect of the supply constraints coming from food and energy. Goods and energy, manufactured goods, food and energy. And what we see in the red line is the effect of the supply constraints coming from services. What are the messages here? On activity, these supply bottlenecks had a very large impact. You can see they're a key reason why activity was low during this period. On inflation, we also see that these constraints contributed a meaningful amount to inflation, between 2 and 3% early in the pandemic, and 1 to 2% around about the time of the inflation surge. Okay, next slide. Now here is, I think, one of the key messages from this chapter, is basically, while these supply bottlenecks mean that for a given rise in demand, we get a lot of inflation, they also mean that when you lower demand, you get more of a fall in inflation and less of a fall in output. What we call the sacrifice ratio, how much it costs to bring down inflation in terms of GDP, that sacrifice ratio actually falls when you have these kinds of supply constraints. How are we showing that here? So the blue line is basically CPI inflation in the US, that's data. What we've done in the red line is we've done a hypothetical scenario where we imagined that the central bank tightened interest rates 3 quarters earlier than it did in the data, and followed the exact same tightening profile, just shifted 3 quarters earlier. And so, as expected, if tightening happens earlier, inflation falls, GDP falls. But that's not the message that I want to push here. In the dotted line, we do the same exercise. What would have happened if the central bank would have tightened 3 quarters earlier, except we remove the supply bottlenecks? So if you compare the red line to the red dotted line, what do you see? You see that without bottlenecks, inflation is actually higher and real GDP is lower, meaning that the same change in monetary policy is less effective at reducing inflation, has a higher cost in terms of GDP losses when there are no supply bottlenecks. So supply bottlenecks can make inflation rise a lot when demand rises, but at the same time, when you bring demand back down, you get a bigger fall in inflation. Okay? That's the first key message. Next slide, please. Okay, second exercise we do is we consider the global nature of these constraints and of the coordinated monetary tightening. So what we're going to do is imagine that the rest of the world in this model tightens 3/4 later than what we observed in the data. And what we're going to do is look at US inflation. That's going to be the graph here, focusing on those two lines. So the blue line is the data again. I've zoomed into 2022, which is when the disinflation process started. The green line is what happens if the rest of the world tightens later. US inflation is higher. So the whole world tightening together helped every country get inflation down quicker. Now, what's the mechanism? If we zoom into the model, this is what's being shown with the different bars, is we can decompose the gap between the blue and green into its components. And we see that the blue, which is basically food and energy prices, is contributing the lion's share to that gap. And so the message here is that this global synchronized tightening helped lower demand for globally traded goods like commodities, and that helped every country get inflation down. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, finally, we do a hypothetical exercise because one part of the COVID experience was that these supply constraints were really widespread. They took place all throughout the economy. And it raises the question, what about the case where there's some supply constraints, but they're not necessarily widespread? And so what we've done here is a hypothetical where we've imposed the supply constraints on food and energy sectors. Now, in the case we've done here, food and energy sectors are less than 20% of the economy. I understand, here, in the CPI basket, food and energy are actually the majority of the weight in the CPI. So maybe take that exact example with a grain of salt. So imagine here we're constraining a small share of the economy. At the same time, we're going to imagine demand for food and energy is going to increase relative to other goods, and overall spending increases. That's what we're seeing here in these graphs. Now, all of these lines embed that scenario. What's different between the lines is what monetary policy does. So in the blue line, we follow a sort of typical approach that many central banks do, which is focus on core inflation. Core inflation removes the most volatile prices from the index. The idea is that this measure predicts medium-term inflation. So it helps you better, focusing on this measure helps you better achieve inflationary outcomes. That's the blue. The red is we focus not on responding to inflation today, but on the forecast of inflation over the next year. The yellow shows the effect of targeting not inflation today, but an average of the past year's inflation. And then the black line shows the case of a 50-50 weighting on the sectors with the supply constraints, because there were some arguments that when there's supply constrained sectors, you should tighten more in response to their price movements, and then 50% on regular CPI inflation. Now, the key message here is that targeting core inflation tends to do pretty well. It gets inflation back to target fairly quickly and returns GDP back to its trend faster than the other rules. Now, to some extent, the yellow line that's smoothing inflation over the last 4 years does bring inflation back down to target fairly gradually. But you can see on the GDP graph, the middle right, that it leads to a prolonged reduction in GDP. Okay, next slide, please. So, what have we learned? Next slide. Looking back, I think the big message is to understand the recent surge, we need to go beyond the traditional way of looking at the macroeconomy. We need to start zooming in to what's happening in different parts of the economy into critical sectors and thinking about how they interact and might affect each other. So inflation spikes in specific sectors can become embedded in core inflation, and also this interaction between surging demand and supply bottlenecks can lead, is crucial to understand basically what's likely to happen to inflation. We have a new lesson and an old lesson. When supply bottlenecks are widespread and demand is strong, the Phillips curve is going to steepen. That's going to lead inflation to surge as many sectors become constrained, as I showed you. At the same time, bringing demand back down, curbing inflation, is actually possible at a lower cost of economic output than if there were no supply constraints. The old lesson, if we go back to a situation, or if we go to a situation where the supply constraints are not widespread, they're only in some sectors, then more traditional approaches to running monetary policy remain appropriate. So targeting core inflation seems to do pretty well relative to other approaches. One more slide. So looking forward, given these insights, we think central bank policy frameworks should identify these conditions under which responding strongly to supply shocks is appropriate, because it's not all the time. So that means more models with sectoral detail, like the one I just showed you, better sectoral data to capture what's happening with inflationary forces to improve forecasts, and in the case where forward guidance is being enacted, some sort of escape clause that will allow you to react if the Phillips curve steepens. That's it from me. Thank you so much.
Are you going to have? Are you going to make some comments or no? Okay. Okay.
There's a different.
Huh?
There's a second presentation.
After.
Either way you want to do it.
Okay. No, then we'll discuss this a little bit, and then go on to the other one. So and then the question answers. Should we do all at the end, Chan? Huh? Okay, at the end. But let me then make a couple of comments on your presentation. And we'll keep that in mind because I will, after his presentation, we'll open it up. You know, if I read your presentation, very, very informative, detailed data, etc., what is the big picture? The big picture that I see is that inflation went up after lower for longer, which lasted a full decade, because of supply constraints. Interestingly enough, the word lockdown was not heard in your presentation. I wonder why, but that supply constraints were caused by the lockdown. Why did inflation go down? Because supply constraints got eased, because the lockdowns were removed and more supply came to the market. So my first question is, what has monetary policy got to do with the recent trend in inflation over the last, so that's my first question. Second, very interestingly, I would have had more of an emphasis. I can see I was also at the fund, why there wasn't special attention given to the misguided Fed policy. US is your biggest owner, as it were, of the IMF, and I think that's where the biggest policy mistake was. Let me just add to that a little bit. If you look at the lockdown started in March of 2020. By 2021, January, February, you already had inflation in Europe, not in the US, already down to almost back to the pre-COVID levels. Then you had a huge supply shock, distortion, oil prices with Ukraine. So was it 21 or 22? 21 it started. So one interesting episode is to look at why was Europe doing so well and why was America doing so badly. So the only part that I sort of, and what the developing countries did, led by Brazil, etc., they did front load. So that part fits the data. They did front load the tightening, and they were the quickest one to ease. So I think a large part of the picture here is the US Fed, a US monetary policy, the Inflation Reduction Act, misappropriately or very appropriately called, rather than an Inflation Reduction Act, it was an Inflation Enhancing Act. So these are just some questions. Now we'll hear Mr. Balima's presentation and then get back to question and answers.
So this will be quite different. This will be quite a different topic.
Huh?
This will be quite a different topic.
Okay. Okay. I didn't have the yeah.
So thank you very much. It's really nice to be here presenting. So my presentation will focus on chapter 3 of the WIO analytical piece that was put out last week. And it focuses on the social acceptability of structural reform. So let me just start with some motivation. Why did we look at the social acceptability angle of structural reforms? It's true that global growth has been enduring a long period of structural weaknesses, and medium-term growth prospect under current policies, we look at 4 to 5 years growth from now, is quite low, around 3.1%, which is lower compared to the average of the past 10 years or so. So in this context, policymakers has been, trying to push out structural reforms. What do I mean by structural reform here? These are the rules and policies that in some way shape how an economy operates, like the way people manage open their business, the way the labor market works, and so on. So, and these policies in some way help to boost productivity, employment, and growth. But as I will show in the next thing, and building consensus is getting even harder over time. So the chart on the left-hand side just show the cross-country distance to the frontiers in, on the one end, the EPL, the Employment Protection Legislation, and the other end, PMR, the Product Market Regulations. It shows that for the EPL parts, the regulatory stance has barely moved over 4 decades. And for the employment protections legislations, we do see a bit the same trends, that for advanced economies, we do see some progress, but for emerging markets, there are still some gaps between countries. At the same time, the middle chart shows basically reform-related protest over time. And what we observe is that this reform-related protest has increased by double since the early 1990. And we do have a really big increase after the global financial crisis. And this may, give an idea that this social resistance, reform-related protests, can be part of the culprits behind the low progress in structural reforms. And we do see indeed that with the final chart, the third chart, we do see that reforms that have been implemented are more likely to be a reverse if those reforms face some kind of protest in a form of strike or protest during the implementation phase. So motivated by these facts, next slide, please. In our chapter, we ask 3 main questions using 3 different tools. First, at the macro level, using macro level data, we ask the question, how difficult has it been to implement structural reforms, looking at the past, and what are the factors that explain reform outcomes? Second, we use micro data, individual level data, to understand the individual level drivers of attitude toward reform, zooming on individual socioeconomic characteristics, the beliefs and perceptions about policies or market economy, the government, and also the role of informations in shaping attitudes. And the first, last questions for policymakers, we zoom on the tools, strategies, and institutions that in some way can help policymakers not only make sure that reforms are implemented, but those reforms are also sustained over time. So next slide will give some kind of preview of our key findings. At the macro levels, I will show that the space of structural reforms has more than halved since the global financial crisis, and more importantly, the use of reform strategies in the form of communication, consultations, and mitigating measures have been more reliable predictors of reform outcome than the context in which the reform was implemented. And at the micro level, I will demonstrate that individual level beliefs and perceptions matter than the self-interest, which are the socioeconomic characteristics. And I will also illustrate how complementary and compensatory measures can help title the balance toward more reform supports. And last but not least, we do use country cases to show that it's not just about a communication strategy. So helping the implement reforms highlight in some way the importance of trust, both in the message and the messenger, the importance of credible and non-partisan institutions that produce policy-oriented research and sell it to the public, and also the importance of a strong institutional setting that facilitate consultation with stakeholders, including in the early stage of reform design. So let me start quickly with the historical analysis. So when we started, next slide please, we started this project, we noticed that in the literature there is a lack of data on reform, successful reform and unsuccessful reforms. So our first approach is to fill this gap. We introduced a novel cross-country narrative database. And how did we build this database? We analyze the Economic Intelligence Unit quarterly reports and use some craft-edging large language models, including ChatGPT-2. For each reform, we identify the policy measure. We also document the reform process when it started with the discussion of the reform, the passing into law, and also the implementation of the reform. We have information wherever the reform was resisted and if the government had to scale back the reform by revisiting the initial plans. And we do also collect information if the government provided compensatory or mitigating measures. And looking at our narrative database, we do see 3 key facts that I show here with 3 areas of reform: electricity sector reform, migrant integrations, and labor market reform to increase the working age. And we just see that the first point is that when we split the sample into 2, before and after the global financial crisis, we just see that the total reform episodes has declined over time in almost all policy fields and across all countries. And second, the data also reveal how difficult it has been to pass structural reforms. As in all cases, we do see that if we compare the blue part compared to the rest, only half of discussed reforms have eventually been implemented. And even when we look at the implemented reforms, we do see that some of them has been quite resisted by the public, the red one, and some of these resisted reform, the government has to scale down the initial plans in order to get it passed. Next slide, please. And then we ask, what are the factors that drive, in some ways, the data that I just illustrated, adoptions, implementations, and so on. So we use a multinomial logit regressions where the dependent variable here is basically our reform outcome from discussed but not implemented to implement it and resist it or dilute it. And the best outcome is when the reform is implemented without any resistance or dilutions. And here we are interested by comparing the contributions of the reform strategy compared to other factors that have been mentioned in the literature, including the macroeconomic context, whether it's good time and bad time, the political context, or the macro framework, if the government has some fiscal space, for instance, or not. Next slide, please. And when we do that comparisons, we do see that macro context and the political context matter. But when we try to compare the relative contributions of the different factors, a key point result that we get is that the reform strategy explain the lion's share of the reform implementation. For instance, here, reform strategy, which include the mitigating measures, communication, and consultations, explain about 22% of reform implementation success, compared to, say, 22% for the political context and even more lower, 16% for the macro context. So what's the message from here? At least for interpretations is that this result shows that the active use of consultation, communication, and mitigating measures have been a more reliable predictors of implementation success than the context in which the reforms are attempted. Next slide, please. And of course, one may say that this historical analysis provides only some correlations, but it highlights the role of the understanding the drivers behind the individual skepticism toward reform. So for that, we move into a survey-level analysis. And what we did is that we conduct 2 online surveys to tackle 3 objectives. Number 1 is to understand individual-level drivers of attitude toward reforms. Number 2, we use a randomized controlled trial to see whether informing people about, say, the cost of the status quo, which is the need for reform, or explaining better the effect of policies can change the attitude toward reforms. And number 3, we introduce some complementary and compensatory measures to see if for individuals who oppose the reform, mitigating like the opposition can help pass the reform. So we ran 2 surveys in 3 countries each with a representative sample of around 12,000 respondents, which is 2,100 respondents per country. Our first survey focuses on product markets, which is basically to improve private participation and competition in electricity and telecommunication sectors. And we ran this survey in Mexico, Morocco, and South Africa. And the second survey focuses on policies to improve the integration of foreign-born workers into the labor markets. And we ran that survey in Canada, Italy, and the United Kingdom. Next slide, please. So going back to the first objective of the survey, which is basically understanding the policy preference at the individual level, one clarification is that, individual preference can be driven by the socioeconomic characteristic. What do I mean by socioeconomic characteristic? These are variables related to age, education level, employment, income level, and geographic locations. And those factors in some way can determine if you are loser or winner of a reform. At the same time, the policy preference can also be affected by beliefs. By beliefs, I mean how I think the policy will affect outcome that matter for me, for instance, on the price, quality of access to electricity, how I believe in the government ability to do the reform, how I view, let's say, corruption in the country, and so on. So the objective here is to disentangle these 2 factors, the individual socioeconomic characteristic on the one hand, and the different set of beliefs and perceptions on the other hand. Why it matters? Because beliefs and perceptions can be affected by policies, and I will show it in the next few slides. So in our survey, we started by collecting individual socioeconomic characteristics, age, education, and so on. We collect the different beliefs and perceptions. We have some randomized setup that I will talk about it later. But here, I will be referring to support quite a lot. So this is how we measure support. Like in the PMR, after collecting the different variables, we ask individuals, do you support or oppose allowing private companies to sell electricity in your country? And for the telecommunication sector, it's the same. And we do the same also for migrant integrations, where we do have different policies for migrant integrations, and we ask individuals if they would support it or not. Next, please. So we then use the survey to test the drivers of policy support. Here in the regressions on the left-hand side, we try to explain individual level supports that I just explained. On the right-hand side, we have some treatment indicator, and I will explain later. We have different variables related to the socioeconomic characteristics like demographics, income, education, different variables related to beliefs. And here, we want to first compare what is the relative contribution of socioeconomic characteristics as opposed to beliefs. Next slide, please. And we do that comparisons here. We use a dominance analysis to decompose the variability in support between socioeconomic characteristics, the first part of each chart, and the beliefs and perceptions. And what do we see? Two observations. Number one is that beliefs matter more than socioeconomic characteristics. Broadly, beliefs explain 80% of the variability compared to socioeconomic characteristics that are roughly between 6 and 10%. Number two is that among the beliefs, if we look at the relative contributions, we do see that knowledge about the effect of policy or knowledge about beliefs about the effect of policy matter more than the other beliefs. That is the first part of the belief block that we do see. It's explained roughly around 30 to 30% of the variability in supports. And the key point here is that if knowledge and effect of policy matter, then there is a way for policy to intervene, because these knowledge and beliefs can be shaped by policies. Next, please. So in the next slide, we use our experimental setup to try to frame that questions, how policy interventions can affect in some way beliefs and perceptions, and therefore affect policy intervention. Next slide, please. So we randomly assign respondents in our survey into different treatment group or a control group, and we try to test basically three main hypotheses. One is, because of a status quo, we only explain to respondents what is the cost of the cost, quality, and access to electricity or telecom in the home country compared to the United States. And we stop there. And it's up to the respondent to see if that's like some opportunity cost that will lead to more support for reform in the sector. And the second hypothesis we test is the effect of policy. Basically, we use research-based evidence and provide it to the respondent. These are the research-based evidence on the policies, how policy in the sector can improve outcome that matter for you. For instance, for PMR, that will be on the price, quality, and access to electricity. And for migrant integrations is how better integrating migrants can affect native job, public finance in terms of the budget, and also the crime rates. So we compare the support for policies between the different treatment group and the control group to identify the treatment effects on support. Next, please. So here, basically, quickly, this is how our treatment works. So for the first bit, example for South Africa is what I call the status quo treatment for the electricity sector, where we explain what is the cost of electricity compared to the United States, and what is the access and quality also of electricity. And the PMR side, we do have also some slideshows showing the benefit of better integrating migrants, and here it illustrates the effect on crime rates. Next, please. So then we estimate our equations that I showed previously to see the treatment effects on support for policies. And the takeaway is that at least for PMR, the results show that informing individuals about the need for reform, the cause of the status quo, has a positive impact on support for policies. We do see, for instance, that support for policy increased by about 4.5 percentage points for electricity sector. And on the second part, we do see that in the electricity PMR reforms, when we complement the status quo with explaining the effect of policy, the effect is even more higher. We do see that in the first bit of the chart, support increases by around 16 percentage points. And for migrant integration, this is the second part, the last block of the chart, we do see that all the free information treatments increase support for policies, but what is most effective is when explaining the effect of policies is, added with the mechanism behind the effect. When we say, okay, better integrating migrants reduce crime, how it affects crime because people have jobs and then they move to, they have free times in some way. And also we explain the better integrating migrant, the effect on fiscal, how it's affect the fiscal outcome through more tax collection, value-added taxes, and labor tax, and so on. Next, please. So in addition, we also collect beliefs about the effect of policies. And what we do see here is that when we estimate the treatment impact on those beliefs, by beliefs, I mean how the respondent thinks that the policy will affect the outcome that matter for them. Here for PMR, price, access, and quality of services, we do see that respondents revise their beliefs positively, meaning that the treatment affects support for policies via the impact on those beliefs. So meaning basically that beliefs is a main channel for support. Next slide, please. So what we notice in our survey is that, okay, the treatment is effective in increasing support for policies, but it's not enough. So we do still have some individuals that do not support the reforms. So we follow with these individuals to better understand why. Next, please. Okay, so we group the reasons for not supporting the reforms into personal reasons, wherever I don't support because I feel that I may lose my job or the price will increase and I may not be able to pay, or societal reason, for instance, I'm opposing to the reform because of the affordability of for the poorest, or in the case of migrant integrations, I do think it's not fair for the natives. And what we observe is that all in all, societal reasons matter more than personal concerns. And more importantly, when we look at the yellow and red bars, this is where we provide some complementary and compensatory measures. For instance, for people who feel that they may lose their job, we follow up with them asking, would you support if the government provides some temporary job protections for the time being that you will find another job? And we do see that those complementary measures are effective in increasing support. It shifts the initial opponents to the reforms by reducing their opposition from 50 to 80%, which is quite significant, suggesting that introducing complementary measures is quite effective in increasing support. Next slide, please. So for those who still remain opposed to the reform, despite the complementary and compensatory measures, we still ask them why. And what we do see here is that those who remain against, they mainly highlight trust in the parties involved and doubt in the institution's ability to carry on with the reforms. And of course, this highlights previous studies, including at the IMF, that highlight the needs of building trust in the reform process, including through governance reform, for instance. Next slide, please. So last but not least, we conduct a review of country cases to identify strategies that governments have used in the past and also to contextualize our previous findings. Next slide, please. So here we focus on the policy fields. This is basically employment protection legislations that has faced quite a lot of resistance, including in India in the past years. And without going into the country details, I will zoom quickly in the next slide on the key lessons that we learned. And the key lesson are threefold. Number one, we defined as first and foremost, it's confirmed the historical analysis that achieving consensus on the need of a reform, both socially and politically, is critical for reform implementation. And achieving consensus can be through, let's say, a more passive way. For instance, in some countries, there were some kind of, I would say, research institutions, non-partisan research institutions that do research and pass the studies, just showing the need for reform in the country. And in some countries, those kind of research was quite effective in boosting support for reform. It can also be a more proactive manner through, for instance, a strong electoral mandate for reform. We have seen those cases, for instance, in France and Denmark, or some extensive communication with key stakeholders, and even in some cases, like in India, doing some pilot case that help demonstrate the benefit of the reform is useful to passing the reforms. Another important message from these country cases is that in addition to building consensus, a sustainable reform also requires some careful policy designs and an implementation that needs in some way to balance the views of different social groups. And that's required in many cases, some extensive negotiations among different societal interest groups as part of a policy design strategy. What do I mean here is that it's not just selling the reform as a final product, but involving these different policy different interest group of stakeholders in the early phase of the reform design strategy. And more often, we do find also that compensation and complementary measures are very useful tools to pass on reform. For instance, in some countries, they manage to have a reform of hiring and firing once after starting, like in the case of India, a reform of the minimum wage. That's helped, in some way shape the road for more reforms. And last but not least, in terms of implementations, we did find that having an institutional setup for some of the strategies that I mentioned previously could yield better outcomes. For instance, we did find that in Denmark, that we have like some kind of tripartite cooperations that regularly meets with unions, business associations, and the government to discuss different reform proposals before even the reform get put forward. So let me conclude with the key finding of our reports. First, next slide, please. We do show that passing reform has been historically challenging, but the use of multiple strategies has been very effective in building consensus, and most of the time, not only one tool is effective in passing the reform. Number two, we did find that beliefs and perceptions about the effect of policies, how policy works, and how policy will affect outcomes that matter for people are key predictors of reform more than individual self-interest. And first, we also show that truthworthy communications can correct people's misperceptions and about the need for reform and also about the effect of policies, and therefore shape the way for the implementation of reforms. And finally, we also zoom on tools and institution use in the reform design strategies, and these include communications, building consensus that are critical to make sure that the reform are implemented but also sustained. Thank you.
That the political lack of political constraints now in doing and trying to understand reforms. I have just a couple of points to make, and then I'll open it up. One, that, and some of this was answered at the end when you had the list of countries, but my prior would have been that surveys are very good. The information gained from surveys that YouGov and IMF have conducted are very good for economies that are not democracies or partial democracies. And this information has a lot of value. And my belief is that in well-developed economies, well-developed democracies, that political economy takes over the driving seat, and information plays less and less of a role, causal role, in allowing reforms to take place. So I thought that was one. Then, the pace of reforms you mentioned in the beginning had halved since 2008, 2009, or whatever the period is. And I've no doubt that that is correct. One interesting, given the richness of the data, would be to see that, the distance from the frontier, if you've already covered a lot of the distance in reforms in these countries, if you will, the term is low-hanging fruit. Most of the low-hanging fruit is gone. Not in India. There's still a lot of low-hanging fruit in India. But most of that goes away, so it becomes more and more difficult to get, and last, to get reforms under that. And last is there's very convincing data and results on the divergence or the difference between the product market reforms versus labor market reforms, their acceptability, etc. Incidentally, you should have, I had to look at the footnote to find out what PMR was, and that's the product. So it is explained there, but it should be there prominently displayed that is. But I think very, very interesting, both sets of, so I'll open it up for questions. Yeah. And what we'll do is we'll collect 3 or 4 questions, and then you can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I must admit I could hear only part of the presentation you made, but within that part, I had one question with reference to India in particular. Despite having thumping majority of the government, and despite having the discussion and all those before the agriculture reforms were rolled out, and the government has to take it back. Only 2.5 states out of 36 state and union territory, 2.5 states oppose it, and government, despite government wanting it to be implemented, could not. So what is one reason? I can anticipate you will say there were not enough discussion. But to me, from the inside story, there was enough discussion. Only the narrative was not good, or the trust between the citizens and the government was deficient. And so what's your take on this?
Yeah, very important. I think there should be a special case study at the IMF and at the World Bank about agricultural reforms. You had a question? Yes.
So I would join you in saying that excellent presentations. So I had a question for you, Nick. The question that I had for you was, in your presentation, I was expecting a link to the subprime crisis, and that's where the balance sheets of these central banks in the Euro, US, UK expanded extensively. So I wasn't very sure if you have captured that part, which then resulted in a spillover. And I would say the trigger came from the war in Europe after nearly 7 decades. But did you look at that link? The second thing that I wanted to mention was I like the econometric modeling that you did, but did you have a chance to look at the capital market movement of the interest rate differential? That might be impacting the investment cycle and then capital formation and growth. Dr. Hippolyte, I had a question for you. One is, I do not know if you have had a chance to look at our reforms in 1991. We had a crisis, and because of that, there was a softening of attitude and a change in belief, and we could undertake massive structural reforms, which almost one could say from a socialist pattern to a Washington consensus, almost. Right? So I do not know if you have had a chance to look at it. So my question to you was, does the type of reforms matter? We did massive reforms that time, but now when we were on the verge to embark on the agriculture reforms, we suddenly found we couldn't do it. So does the type of reforms matter? And does the crisis offer you an opportunity which should not be missed? Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead. And then we'll take you, let him do. I saw his hand first, that's the only reason there. Yeah.
Yeah, so I found the paper on social acceptability of structural reforms very interesting.
Just speak into the mic.
Yeah, I'll just shift. Yeah. I hope now I'm audible. Yeah, I found the chapter 3, which is part of the social acceptability of structural reforms, very interesting. It was actually a very interesting paper. Two things the 2 questions which are connected questions. One is, I believe you talked about beliefs. So I believe that given that now we have social media, which actually amplifies these beliefs, and it actually creates those echo chambers and also influences the type of the narrative we have. So I just wanted to understand that, did you try to figure it out somewhere, that how the growth of social media would impact the reforms in future? The second thing you talked about, the governance and the institutions, they are very important, and even the current Nobel Prize was on that point. But something I wanted to talk about, what Dr. Charan Singh had also raised about the crisis thing, of the context in which those reforms are placed. Because one of the point you mentioned, like you gave an example of Brazil, you started small. That means something which is easy, on which something consensus can be built on. But what I think is that at a lot of times, if we mix something, because there are winners and losers on the both side. So at a lot of times, if you mix something, that something hard and something soft, something which we can push. So I just wanted to understand that I do understand the methodology you have taken it, but any insights on that, and what's the thinking behind it? Thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Congratulations to both the presenters. I
Yeah,
think both.
just you hold the mic.
Yeah.
There.
So both the presentations were very insightful and informative. So I have a question for Nick, which was on crate tightening. So basically, we have seen this reaction of Feds, the banks, reserve banks, like in India also, in the COVID time as well as during post-COVID time, and especially during the Russia-Ukraine war. And we all know that whatever inflation was increased, it is mainly because of supply constraints. But the reaction, of different Feds were different. Like some were very impulsive, increasing like repo rate in like 50 basis points, 60 basis points in every quarter kind of thing. And there are some very conservative kind of Feds which were in control and which were waiting for the time. And we all know that, increasing repo rate is like compromising, or you have mentioned in one of your slides, sacrifice ratio, that sacrificing on the growth. So I just want to understand from you, what is your understanding? I mean, have you done this kind of analysis like country wise? I'm sure you must have seen some of the countries other than US, like India and many other low income countries as well as emerging economies, that whether this kind of reaction, I mean, role of Fed and like Reserve Bank of India is very important in taking calls on these kind of things. So whether uh, I mean, what kind of, when we clearly know that this is supply driven, not demand driven, what kind of reaction should be taken? I mean, and then when the recovery phase comes, as Sir has said, then what is the role of Fed? Whether immediately it should go ahead for reducing the repo rates and all, which is a major discussion these days in India. And my second question is related to core inflation, which is sticky, and the food inflation and fuel. We know that quite volatile. But it is being observed that the banking institution, financial institutions are always like, whatever is leading to the lesser repo rate is generally there. I mean, the target is like that. That if the core is high, then they say that this is sticky, and that should that should not be, that should be seen with a different lens. And when there is volatility in the food and fuel, they say that it should be it should be separated from the overall or headline inflation. So what is your analysis? We would like to get some insight on that. Thank you.
Yeah. So why don't you take your set of questions and then he can take his set.
Sorry. Thanks everyone very much. These are great questions. I think to start with the questions Dr. Singh started with. So did we look at this link to subprime crisis and balance sheets, and then also capital market movements of rate differentials? We didn't, and it's not to say that those aren't important, but what we were trying to do was to focus on what we thought were the key drivers of the inflation experience. And in terms of balance sheets of financial institutions and subprime, for much of the pandemic, banks' balance sheets were pretty healthy, as best as we could observe. There was some issues in the US with their treasury market that required what was one part of the extraordinary monetary measures taken. There was the case of Silicon Valley Bank and other things, but that didn't seem very largely widespread. And then I don't know of much things going on in other countries. So we took the view that that was not key to really understand what's going on. The sort of key thing seems to be all these supply constraints we saw in goods markets. Similarly with capital market movements of rate differentials, and I think that's similar to the question you raised about looking at countries other than the US. I'm going to give an unsatisfying answer, which is more watch this space. So the model we developed is really, it was basically in the works just for this chapter. It's 2 countries at the moment, and we're looking at making it larger, and that's absolutely an ambition we're going to do. Part of making it larger to capture the global nature of these shocks is we have to think about capital markets. We have to think about how rate differentials affect the flow of capital. We have to think about how that affects some countries differently to others. So those I think are that they are important, and unfortunately I don't have interesting things to say yet, but I hope to. The other sort of comment I want to make about is about thinking about these supply constraints. What's the sort of rough message I want to give from the chapter is, I think we had this thoughts on supply shocks before the pandemic. We sort of think of these as things you might want to look through. They happen, they're small, or they're not very long lasting, and we can a monetary central bank can ignore them. They'll unwind themselves. And I think in the pandemic what we saw is that when they're large and when they're particularly a bottleneck, literally you're not able to produce more for some amount of time, they seem to work differently. And I think the message I would give in terms of thinking about supply is, I think the look through or respond aggressively depends on the type of supply shock. In the case we saw in the pandemic of a bottleneck, we actually, we actually see that they, interact with demand to create inflation. If the demand's not there, it doesn't matter if you've a bottleneck, right? It's not affecting production because there's no demand. If demand is there, the bottleneck has a huge effect. Now, what's one tool that affects demand across the whole economy? It's monetary policy. So monetary policy affect the interaction of these supply bottlenecks with demand by affecting demand. And that's the key point, is that that sacrifice ratio, the sort of GDP loss you'd get when you tighten policy when these bottlenecks are pervasive, is very low, because the bottlenecks are what's constraining GDP. So lowering demand is not really having as much an effect on GDP, but has a larger effect on prices. So I think these shocks could happen again, but also they're quite different to what we observed previously. And I'll leave it there so Hippolyte can respond to his great questions.
Questions too. I will start with the comments on non-democracy. So this is quite a questions that keep us busy when we started these projects, and actually the thinking was on the reverse side, because we are thinking about social acceptability. It's matter more to look at democracies, because the social acceptability angle is more binding for political constraint. Okay, I do not agree with the way you formulate your policies. I can in some way sanction you during the next election. That was, the discussion and where we did focus on in the survey side. But in the macro parts, you are right that when we run the analysis, we have as key control a variable for each country level of democracy, and we also run the analysis for robustness on democracies and non-democracies. The low-hanging fruit, it's true that, of course, when you start with reform that's easiest to pass, like electricity sector reform, maybe unbundling is much more complex than very small reforms. So that can make it relatively not easy to pass over time, and that can also drive the result that we do have here. But it's true also that when we look at the gaps, the distance to the frontiers that we observe, at least for emerging markets, we do have quite some variabilities, meaning that, of course, they may have started with a low-hanging fruit, but there is still a long way to go. I have two questions on India, one on why it's not passed, and the other one on looking at 91. So I wouldn't answer, the questions directly on the labor market reform for India. We did look at it basically to learn lessons from the past. It's been like through different governments with discussions about the reforms. India is a very specific case because you have different layers, the central governments and the local governments, and that can make it a bit more complex, the political economy to passing reform. Maybe Ranil can comment a bit on why it's adopted but not implemented yet. On looking at 91 and the role of crisis as an opportunity, I didn't have time to discuss the macro context and political context deeply, but in the chapter what we highlighted is that sometimes crisis is an opportunity to pass reform, because when there is a crisis, the opportunity cost of reform is much more visible. Like you look at Greece of a crisis, it was evident that, of course, tax revenue is low, and then we need to do something about it. In Brazil, when we look at the labor market reform, it was pretty clear that when they started the labor market reform, there were a lot of regulations for employment protection legislation, and they needed to do something about it. So that's, in some way, crisis can be an opportunity. But of course, what we find also is that it depends from one reform to another reform. Labor market reform is much more salient, but for other reform, it may not be the case. The question on social media, true, we didn't look at it because of also the type of questions we were asking. But I would say that it can affect beliefs in both ways. If you do have trustworthy information that get passed into social media, it can positively affect beliefs. At the same time, if you do have misperceptions through social media, depending on the different groups, it can also negatively affect beliefs. But that's basically maybe some area for future research. On incremental steps, Yes, I agree. What we did find also is that sometimes it's much more easier to go step by step. I mentioned the labor market reform. We start with, okay, I tackle the minimum wage part, maybe increase the minimum wage, the social different groups are a bit happier, and then I can start negotiating on, let's say, the number of days, like before layout and so on. And what we did find from these case studies is that most of the time going through incremental steps is useful to pass reform rather than trying to do everything once at a time. Now we stop here.
Yeah. Now, for the last, you didn't answer about agricultural reforms, but I'll let Ranil have the last word on that, as well as any other issues that you'd like to bring up.
Sure, thanks, Surjit. So, yeah, I mean, their study, they were looking at more the labor market reform, and I would say that's a reform that's, I think, still being implemented, right? We're having more and more states moving towards accepting the new labor codes. Agricultural reforms, they didn't really look at, so it's a little unfair to ask him, and I'm not sure I'm an expert on this either. Because that's an example of a reform that has reversed, right? The government pulled back. And I think you are right. It seemed to be 2 or 3 states that drove, and maybe close to Delhi, 2 or 3 states close to Delhi that were able to change the political dynamic related to, but I'm truly not an expert on that. And I wasn't in India when that was occurring. So I don't know if you have a view or Dr. Balla has a view on that.
No, okay. No, on agricultural reforms, actually, the conventional wisdom in India is that there wasn't enough discussion. And I really think this should be the next project for your division, et cetera, to really objectively look at it. I think there has been extensive discussion about minimum support prices, the PDS, and all the rest of it for the last, I would say, since 1978, you count, almost 50 years of discussion. And the political economy stupid, as Bill Clinton might say. But this has been very, very interesting, informative, not as exciting as a test match, but quite exciting nevertheless. Thank you very, very much for coming here and let Chavan sing.
So I want to thank all of you for being here with us on a busy Monday afternoon. Knowing very well that I gave you a very short notice, I just sent out the invites in the middle of the last week and by Thursday. So I understand the short notice. I really want to thank all of you for having joined us. I want to thank you, Dr. Ranil, for giving us this opportunity to co-host this important discussion on the World Economic Outlook. I know today Chapter 1 is being released, and that's going to be very interesting. I'm myself looking forward to India's growth at 7, 6.8 or 7.2. So that's more exciting than cricket match, sir. You will agree with me. I want to thank both of you, Dr. Nick and Dr. Hippolyte, to fly down from Washington. I know at lunch you were mentioning about the jet lag. We in the Reserve Bank have done it all the time. The Reserve Bank, we are short of money. I know I'm being recorded. So we used to fly in on the morning of the meeting and fly out immediately after 5 p.m. rush to DC airport and return. So I'm so much familiar with the jet lag, but despite the jet lag, you did a great job. Thank you for that. I interestingly wanted to tell you about the balance sheet of central banks, not of commercial banks, because the expansion of the balance sheets of central banks was like a no tomorrow, 4 times. First after the Lehman Brothers, and then double in COVID. And if we are not, even if we are not monetarists and don't follow Milton Friedman all the time, But such a huge expansion and the balance sheet would have certainly exploded, if not tomorrow, day after. And I think the trigger, the last straw on the camel's back, came from the European war, and it just exploded. So I want to thank you for flying in and sharing your thoughts with us. And of course, the chairperson, Dr. Bhalla, I requested him only on Friday, and he agreed to kindly sit with us and chair this session. So, all in all, thanks for this excellent discussion, and high tea is waiting for all of us outside. Thank you very much.